This is an LA-CTO Forum production.
Welcome to Exception Handlers, the podcast where CTOs debug the challenges that keep us up at night. I'm Alex.
And I'm Bill.
And on today's episode, we're delighted to interview Jared Zoneraich, CEO and co-founder of PromptLayer. Jared, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
We really appreciate having you on the show. And just to start with, can you give us a little bit of an overview of who you are, your career, and really why you're qualified to speak to the topic of the day, which is agents and agentic development?
Totally. Well, it's also new, so I feel like we all might be almost equally qualified at this point. But I am, as you said, the founder of PromptLayer, and we are a platform that teams use to build and test LLM products and agents. And we've been doing this since ChatGPT came out. I've been in the AI ML world before that at Tecton, which was a feature store company, and my co-founder comes from a deep learning background, and we've been all around. We've helped hundreds or maybe thousands of teams ship AI into production, whether it's through our product or through helping them use our product or advice, and been kind of on the cutting edge of what the abstractions are, how people are building agents, how to do this well. So I have opinions. Some might be good, some might be bad, and but I'm in the arena, as they say.
Fantastic. Well, we would love to hear some of the spicier opinions you have, perhaps as we go through it. But just to get us started, not everyone, and by everyone I mean Bill and I, are familiar with agents as much as we should be. And we would love some basic definitions of what is an agent, what do people say, what do people mean when they say DAG and the agentic loop? Just give us some kind of foundational concepts here.
Yeah. So let's do some definitions. So firstly, agent is the elusive word. So technically, an agent actually predates this LLM fad that we've had, not fad, but this LLM craze, maybe is the better
revolution
word we've had. Yeah. It predates this as a technical term for kind of, it comes from ML and decision making, and maybe someone can give you a more technical definition than me, but the way I look at it is it's a process that chooses its own path and can make decisions into the flow. So when we talk about coding agents, for example, it's not just a LLM call that writes a snippet of code, but it's an LLM call that can choose where to write the snippet of code, choose if it needs to run the snippet, and do these sort of things. So that's what an agent is. And then you mentioned DAGs. So I like to draw a big distinction between a DAG-based LLM workflow, which is one where you would say, first research the person, then write an outline for the essay, and then write the essay itself, versus an agentic workflow, which is one where you say, hey, your overall goal is writing an essay for a person, figure out the steps, take the steps, and then do it without prescribing it. It's like a prescriptive versus agentic difference. Does that line up to your definitions?
I mean, to the degree we have definitions, sure. Yeah.
It checks off a few of them.
Yeah. Well, so I guess maybe let's get into this a little bit. And it seems like whether you want to say this is a controversy or just attention or just a kind of an organically evolving thing, DAG versus agentic loop. If you were going to build an agent, as you've described, you have two ways of doing it. You've either sort of prescribed the details of the workflow, or you're letting the agent one input at a time, figure out what to do next, what tools to use, and ultimately get to some endpoint. What's the tension here? Why one versus the other? When one versus the other?
Right. So the tension here is, well, maybe we could step back and talk about the current progress of models to answer this question. So I think when ChatGPT 2, ChatGPT 3, 3.5, when those were coming out and we were still being blown away by the simple ChatGPT.com, uh, models weren't good enough to run them for hours and have them taking their own path for hours or days at a time. So we actually built prescriptive DAGs as a way to kind of push the model into a certain workflow that we wanted it to be in. Now, models have gotten much, much better. We've kind of built new abstractions around it. And look at Claude Code. And I like to call this the Claude Code moment, is when it all switched. So it's no longer the best way to prevent hallucinations and add guardrails by adding prescriptive DAGs. It's a much better way to solve a problem by creating a simple while loop with tool calls. And that's the agent. An agent is basically, it keeps running and it says, what tools do I have? Runs the tools, gets the response, and decides if it wants to do more. So the big tension here is, if you're in a larger enterprise, you're going to be more worried about compliance and guardrails and making sure what is the United Customer Support bot that gave free credits to people back in the day? That was like a big story, I think, a few years ago. You're going to be worried about that, and you're going to. We have. I'll give you one more example. So our product, right, is a product for prompt versioning, agent design, evals, analytics, and we have. There's one customer I'm thinking of who used us, and they built 150 node DAG. And it was very impressive, and it was very good. It was the state of the art in their sector. And then when this switch came and the models got better and the Claude Code moment happened, they actually tore it all down in favor of a simple loop with tools. And this is especially significant because they thought their first iteration was their defensibility, was like the complexity was the defensibility. So we're simplifying, is what I'll say.
And along those lines, because that was the first thing that really caught my eye when we were having the conversation about the, it's not endless, but the dynamic loop versus this predictable quote unquote path, is you're working with unbounded systems. How are you able to convince somebody like that, okay, look, we can do these loops and still make sure that we have a reasonable chance of, outcomes that are not tragic?
That's the billion-dollar question, I would say. But there's a few ways I'd break it down. I think, first of all, the simplest answer is you're going to be able to just do so much more with the agentic loop that it's going to be hard to resist. So there's just so many problems that can be solved much better with an agentic loop. The development time is simpler because it's a simpler system. It's much less of a complex system. And there's tools you could take. So instead of having a prescriptive DAG, maybe you're working on specific tool calls that have deterministic checks. Maybe you're doing a lot of evals. Maybe you are spending a lot more time on the context engineering and the prompt engineering side. I think there's solutions that could be taken, but it's a trade-off, as all things in engineering are.
Yeah, it seems like at a certain level, you're kind of zooming out on the QA aspect of it. You're looking at final results as opposed to intermediary results.
Right. Well, intermediary matters too, because in my opinion, the best way we have these agents that are running for an hour, let's say, and they're running hundreds of tool calls. You can't look at every step, but in those steps is the real information on how you can make it better. Because input output, it could arrive at the right answer, but maybe you can make something that arrives at it in half the time. And I think the trace, we point a lot of teams to the tracing and the observability side of it as a way to improve.
That makes sense.
Actually, one thing that just occurred to me, you mentioned that so it's kind of clear in a DAG what is it you're actually building, and to the point you made earlier, the company you worked with built so much of it that they've started considering it to be their defensible IP mode, which is pretty impressive.
Right.
In the world of I have a loop and tools, what is the building? Is it the tools that you're adding to the system? Is it the prompts you're adding to this? Could you just talk a little bit more about what is it that you're actually doing when you're developing that loop agent?
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're first defining the problem. Let me try to think of an example. Let's go to
And like,
customer.
what shape does that definition take? Is this a prompt that's ultimately, I just,
Right. I see.
we're ignorant to the space, so we really want to understand like what it actually means to say I'm building an agentic loop agent,
Totally.
and these are artifacts I'm producing.
In other words, I guess, what are the primitives involved in an agent?
Yes.
And how I would break it down is you have the starting prompt. So what are you asking the agent to do? As well as the context given to the agent. So now the context is often a file system. I think a lot of these agents have become really good because we've given it a file system and a scratch pad and given it an access to bash. So it could be flexible and work around. An agent really, you're giving it a few tools and it's solving a problem from first principles. So when you give it a good prompt, you can maybe have it skip some steps and you could say, hey, you don't actually have to rederive this combination. This is how you do it. But more concretely, you're giving it you're choosing which harness. So you're choosing whether you want to use Cloud Code or Codex or make your own. You're choosing the model. You're choosing the files it starts with, so the context. And all that boils down to you're choosing which tools the model has access to. So does it have access? Maybe instead of a file system, you want to give it a SQL server, a SQL database, or a vector database. But at the core, there's a very simple loop. The agent just runs while true, right? While true, run a tool out of however many tools you want, get the results, and decide whether you want to run another tool or return the results. And that's it. It's like a 3-line thing you could represent it as. There's some nice stuff, whatever, and sugar and stuff like that. But at the core, it's just keep running until you've finished. And the core decision making it has on each heartbeat is which tool out of X tools should I use?
Okay. That's it. Okay. No, that all makes sense. I guess the other thing about this is, how does it know it's done? What is it looking at to determine the end? This is the end.
Yeah, I think all these are also like very application level questions that are very use case specific. So,
Right.
how does when you're building an agent for your system, how do you help it know when it's done? And it's really about teaching it the problems it needs to solve, or by teaching it, I mean prompt engineering, or giving more examples, or there's things like stop hooks where every time the agent responds something, you can force another question. So this is if you've seen this Ralph Wiggum technique, it's basically says, do you want to keep running? And that's the stop hook there. But we've used it in a way of making sure the model can give an answer in a specific type or keep going until it finishes. But the finished question is part of this problem. Basically, everything is about the subject matter expertise and the domain expertise. And it all boils down to this. And that's why, I mean, speaking personally for PromptLayer, our system we build for both engineers and the domain experts on the team, because we think the best products are built with both of them.
And that makes total sense. One of the things I'm thinking about from my personal perspective is that the loop model seems to be best suited when you have a decision that's in a broader scope that can be achieved via many different outputs. In other words, a document talking about the state of affairs of the economy, something like that, that's broad, which can have a lot of different pieces. The pieces can be very different and yet still build a very accurate view of what the economy looks like, as opposed to where I think DAG probably still has a strong toehold is the places that demand reproducibility. And the reason I say that is because I'm over in that world where we're doing semantic analysis. And if we rerun the test, we had better be plus or minus, a couple of % of where we ran it last time. So the latitude that we can give to the models is much smaller.
Right. I think that's a great point. Even though the world is moving to these agentic loops, and we've had customers tear down 6 months of work for it, there's still types of problems that you don't want it, or maybe you want a combination. So
that makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a few examples of internal projects we've built. For example, every time a customer signs up for a product, we have a workflow, more like a DAG, that researches the company, sees if it's relevant, and then writes an email to send to them and sends
Yeah.
it. But we have this email is very highly tailored. We had our VP of sales like sit down, really craft it. So we don't want the agent figuring it out every time. But
Yeah, bring the potential client joy could end up in very weird ways.
maybe it'll send them money or something. Who knows? And I think
Photos of their favorite ice cream it picked up in Facebook without saying anything.
that would be pretty cool, though. That might work. I think how I would describe the difference or the heuristic to choose is an agent's really good in a problem that needs exploration to solve.
Yes.
And a DAG is really good in a problem that is always solved in the exact same way, and you don't ever want it to differ.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about that too is on the agentic side, the broad scope of perspectives that it can bring into a problem. It may give you a perspective on it that you absolutely weren't thinking about, but is still valid.
Totally. There's and then one other thing I'd also add here is I think matters a lot is the engineering time and the engineering complexity. I think agentic loops are so appealing because it's just easier and it takes less code and you're writing in English for a lot of it as opposed to having like 10 complex files touching each other. So that has to be put in there too, in terms of like system engineering and making sure your system doesn't make mistakes. You want the invest either in dev time or in how good the product is, and they're all linked and they're all part of that trade-off.
So we obviously spent quite a bit of time now talking about kind of the differences between the two approaches and when they're applicable. And you've mentioned that like measurement is a big part of this. I actually am curious just more broadly, assuming, so DAG measurement's kind of a clear thing and well understood and conceptually makes sense. What does it look like for an LLM loop to be measured? Well, what are we actually doing there? How are we actually solving that issue?
Another great question. I think it depends on the domain. So for example, I'll tell you about how our evals product is structured, and then I'll kind of go high level and talk about how you do this. So our evals product is basically a spreadsheet where you can add new columns. And we have a lot of column types like code execution or LLM as judge or running another prompt, or like we have like 20 or 30, but at the core, evaling is running a set of heuristics on a lot of cases. And the most common case we see is just a back test. So, hey, let's just run this prompt on the last 1,000. Let's see if the output changed, or let's see how much, maybe the cosine similarity. And then stepping up a level, how I see evals being done is there's kind of like two types. There's the more advanced, I'd say, like the regression set evals. So the team that has these evals, every time they update the prompt, they have a CI/CD that checks them and fixes them. And this is kind of the golden standard, but I would almost argue it's kind of like a false goal. It's good. If you could do it, it's good. But what we see way more is people doing sprint-based evals. So, hey, my customer support bot is responding in the wrong language. All right, let's do a 2-week sprint to fix that. So first, I'm going to get a back test. I'm going to get an old historical data set. I'm going to try it. I'm going to write a specific eval for this specific problem. And in those cases, we actually don't see people looking at the old evals very much after time. So evals is changing, though. All this might change. Maybe you have an agent eval it, and it makes it a little simpler. How do you eval an agent is a whole another question. But yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
That brought up in my mind really quickly the thought of how do you fix something that's in a loop-based? Like, what's your approach to a loop-based system where it's not generating what we want? Do you try and decompose it? Do you isolate?
Yes. So I would break it down in a few different ways. The first most obvious way is just input to output. Treat it as a black box, and are you getting the right result? All right, now let's say we have the right result, or maybe that's not even a useful heuristic because it's just way too general purpose. The next breakdown I'd say is something I call a little bit agent smell. So what are the deterministic metrics we can pull? How many times did it run tool calls? How many tools had retries or error responses? How long did it take? How much money did it cost? How many tokens? That sort of thing. That's a good heuristic to see. Did it go up or down? Can we get the tool call? So we built an agent for using our own platform that our users use. Actually, we just launched it. And part of our process of making it better was saying, hey, it ran 100 tool calls for this request. Can we get that down? Can we get it to 50 or 20? So those are the deterministic ways. And then the more behavioral way is to say, what in this trace is going wrong, or where are there user frustrations in this trace? And can we dive into this and spot check it and spot fix it? Or have an LM as a judge telling us, this looks good, or this is, it seemed to get stuck in this point. So there's a lot of greenfield here, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of, I've seen internal companies building smart metrics and insights. But to me, all roads kind of lead back to production observability and having those logs.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And actually related to that, so you've mentioned a bunch of stuff around this already, but like, what does monitoring overall look like for something like? So you mentioned, how many tool calls are you making? I guess like maybe even a more basic thing, like, how are you measuring that it did the right thing? You mentioned earlier there was an example of somebody or agent responding in the wrong language. What is the monitoring of all that looking like? How are you actually monitoring what's happening? What are you monitoring for?
Log as much as you can. And connect it to the iteration process. So what we do through PromptLayer, and even if you're not using PromptLayer, what you should be doing is you should be versioning all this and connecting the versions to the log and being able to roll back, being able to see prod versus this, or A/B test, or doing some feature flagging. And I think that is that's the big takeaway for me on observability. I think, of course, you have traces, you can group them by sessions, and you could do all that fun stuff. But really tying it back to the iteration layer and closing the loop is very important.
And I think I would add getting really efficient in how you logs, because I have found that not only has the source itself exploded, but the logs have gone up exponentially as I've built more stuff with AI.
Yeah, we have to keep decreasing our sample rate.
Yeah, or at least find the sweet spot of how much is enough.
I don't. All I know is our Sentry bills were through the roof, and we had to, all right, a little less.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. I want to just maybe switch topics a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of future focused conversation about this. So I think one of the things you've said, or not in this conversation, but prior, I've heard this prior from you, was that sometimes DAGs are coding around model flaws. So there's something that the model isn't doing, and you're overcoming that with DAGs. If you were to sort of fast forward this thing a couple of years into the future, or maybe a couple of months into the future, actually, I don't even know how long, but like, what are you thinking is going to happen with this DAG versus LLM loop trade-off as the models get bigger or better, bigger? Where do you see those kind of materialize? Just talk to me a little bit about, like, if I'm not starting today, but I'm starting a year from now, what does my world look like when it comes to agentic development?
No, that's a hard question a year from now.
Of course.
I think DAGs are pretty uninteresting going forward. I think the harness, the agent harness, meaning the loop and tools and all that stuff, like Claude Code has a headless version, so does Codex. I think these are core abstraction primitives that are going to be relevant in building, and maybe you'll build a DAG of those. But at the core, the primitive that is going to be the primitive of 2026 most likely is a harness, an agent harness. I think
maybe are there like model limitations? So like I'll give you one example that I'm very familiar with, and I think we all are painfully familiar with for agentic development, software development, which is context compaction. Is a terrible terrible pain, and I imagine it has a role to play in the sort of development of LLM loop agents. Do you see stuff like that improving, which allows you to do more and worry less about the DAG guardrails? That's the kind of thing I'm interested in.
I almost classify that under the harness. So how does the harness do compaction? Does the I don't know if you've seen some do handoffs instead of compaction, and you just hand it off to a new thread, and that's way quicker. AMP from source code does that. But I consider that the harness. That's That's almost engineering after the model's created of what's going around it. In terms of model flaws, most of them are going away. I think.
Wow. Okay, you heard it here first.
I mean, I think we, as engineers, we have to build in a scalable way, and what that means today is at the rate these models are getting better. If you're over indexing on today, you have to rewrite too many times. So it pays to build around where the models are going. And it's very clear to me that the big frontier labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, all of them, are investing heavily on these coding harnesses and these coding agents. And because they're making a lot of money from them, which means they're going to make the models work better from them. So if you're living in that world, you're living in the world where they're making it better and better at such a rate that it's almost... there's small issues here and there. I think if you want some predictions on that one, I think it's crazy that we're all setting up our own sandboxes and we're all doing all this stuff. I don't see why we can't just, as an API endpoint, call out to the Codex agent instead of the Codex model. I don't want to have to recreate. All our customers are recreating like Bash as a tool call or this as a tool call, where just let the lab do it or something.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, you look at the introduction, quote unquote, of MCP last year, right? And we've got this explosion of services and agents or whatever they want to call them, et cetera, happening out there. And a couple of things strikes me. One is without what you call a harness, I've always called it the orchestrator, but same thing. If you don't have something out there that can be timely in terms of its knowledge of what's available, then you run into a situation where you may be tunneling, for lack of a better term, on your access to various different processes that you could take advantage of in services. And it's not just the ones like, oh gosh, there's a thing that does this accounting feature better than mine. It's, 2 days ago, there was a pretty bad security risk and I'm aware of it right now. And we avoid that site at all costs, or I bring it to your attention, et cetera. And that kind of up-to-date knowledge in this world of quicksand in terms of information is, I think, going to be increasingly more valuable. And that's where this is really appealing to me.
Right. That's the hard part, staying up to date.
We're at the part now where I'm losing track of how much I don't know and need to follow up on.
Sometimes you see a release Anthropic released this, and I didn't even read the last release yet.
Well, which actually brings up another thought I'd be interested in hearing what you think about is we have releases coming out from different models. I used a number of different models, so I'm getting bombarded with it. But the timing in terms of introducing them and the flow of, does it change the behavior of this? Is that just something where you treat it like any other change? You go back to your heuristics and just run some tests on it? Or is there something that you think that operates? Do you have a rule of thumb for updating models? Like, as you said, we had a big shift. You went from 2.5 to 3 to 4 all of a sudden, unless it was 4.0, all of a sudden it got a lot better.
Right. And for example, GPT-5 was a big switch that a lot of people actually had to rewrite their prompts for.
Exactly.
So it boils back to the eval question of, do you have a good way to kind of peer into the black box and see if it's working? Do you have a good kind of backtest or good LMS judge that you can kind of swap it out and say it kind of works, but maybe the stupid answer here, which is maybe the right one, is the new models are going to be better right now, and they're going to be so much better that you might as well just switch. And
and just a quick follow-up. Does that mean step back and restart the process of, now that I'm working with this, what I'm asking to do, it may change? Because
Probably.
the model itself can now, instead of being asked to do a variety of things, it can do those things in a single question or a query.
Yeah, even I would look at it as, what can you delete?
Yes.
So the GPT-5 switch was a good example of this, because people had kind of over prompted for the older models. And now that it was a reasoning model, it was actually much better at solving ambiguity. And actually, if you were being too discreet with how to do it, in the same as this agentic conversation, it was actually worse. So in the same way, new models and new technology, same as other forms of engineering, mean we can simplify systems and delete complexity from our systems.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about what it means to have, agentic AI kind of as one of the capabilities your engineering team relies on. Because it's one thing for like a library you depend on to change, and you're figuring out sort of the new APIs to use, and you use them. But at least that's discrete and obvious. It's a whole other thing to say, there's now a reasoning capability that requires my prompts to be rewritten in a way that I'm not asking it to do too much. That's a really interesting conceptual switch that I don't know if people really appreciate or know how to deal with.
I don't even know if OpenAI knew how to tell people to fix it. They knew to tell people, hey, you probably got to update your prompts and give some guidance. But even the labs, I don't think, have a good understanding of which model is better for which use case and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's a fascinating world we live through. Every time we have a conversation, that pretty much is the final concluding thought. We are going through something. And
it's like, buckle up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, this was a really interesting conversation. We really appreciate you being here and giving us lots of insights on agents and building them the right way in this new world. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, if you found this topic interesting and relevant to you, LA CTO Forum has lots of opportunities to engage with other CTOs on topics just like this one. If you're interested in learning more, find us on LinkedIn or on the web at lactoforum.org. And until next time, may your deployments be smooth and your tech debt manageable.
And remember, if you can't handle the exception, at least log it properly. We'll catch you next time.